Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska. And my guest today is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And we're going to have a little chat today about a particular Alexander Technique direction. It's, I think, kind of a new one. Um, I almost feel like I invented it somehow, but it was. But anyway, there it is. It's and about the direction and a couple of variants on it and what the implications of that are. So the direction that I have in mind is I'm not doing as a direction, and anyone listening to that could certainly experiment with that. And the idea, what I was thinking of is, okay, inhibition's a really good thing, everyone agrees, but the question is how you get there.
Mhm.
And it seems to me a direction like that is bringing direction and inhibition together kind of very explicitly. Anyway, so there's that direction. And then the two variants that I've been playing, and I think you've been exploring as well, are I'm not doing anything and I'm not doing everything. So tell me, I know you've been experimenting and you shared some of this with some of your students. What have you found from playing around with?
Well, my initial I haven't been playing with the kind of core, just I'm not doing. I've been playing with I'm not doing anything and I'm not doing everything.
Mhm.
So my initial response was that I was very drawn to that I'm not doing everything. I was like, oh phew, I'm not doing everything, right? I don't have to do everything. And that can lighten my load in this moment of what I'm doing. And yet the more and more I've played with them, the more and more I like I'm not doing anything. The
Mhm.
more and more I notice that it seems to be mostly the more helpful thought.
But would you,
Um,
in your experience though, are they, in terms of when you use them, what comes out of that, fairly similar between the two?
yeah, well, I am noticing that what's the word? I am noticing that I let go of more excess tension,
Mhm.
typically with I'm not doing anything,
Okay. And
more than with I'm not doing everything.
mhm.
Um, and I think, and that wasn't happening right at the very beginning, first day or two of me playing with these two ideas. But
Mhm.
the more I've kind of know that I'm not doing anything doesn't mean I'm not doing anything. It
Right.
means but it's telling myself uh, the way I interpret it, intellectually, of course, I don't really know what's going on, is that my body's recognizing with that there's a lot less that it needs to do.
Right.
And it doesn't even leave the option with I'm not doing everything, leaves the option that, oh, you're still doing something. Whereas, which of
Right.
course you still are.
Right.
But for me, I think there's something about that. And it also reminded me of the didn't you'd know better than me, didn't Marjorie Barstow use a phrase like something like it's just a little bit of nothing or
Oh, Marjorie
some
Barlow. Yeah, she used
oh,
to.
Barlow, okay.
Barlow. She used to say, "Oh, it's just a little bit of nothing," and then she would tell people when you go home from the workshop and they ask you what you were doing, you probably shouldn't tell them that you learned how to do a little bit of nothing because they won't know what you're talking about. I should back up just a second that this
Mhm.
idea for this direction, the original one, I'm not doing, leaving it
Mhm.
open-ended, emerges really out of what are called paradoxical directions, which I know you
Mhm.
you love and I love too,
mhm.
where let's say you're doing an activity like you're walking, you're going for a walk or you're hiking up a mountain or whatever, and you just say, I'm not walking, or think, I'm not walking. And obviously you're doing something that sure looks a lot like walking, but my interpretation is what you're saying to yourself is, what your prefrontal cortex is saying to the rest of your brain is, figure out a better way, or figure out a different way, really. Just figure out a different way to walk. I don't want to be walking the way I usually do. I want a different way. And in practice, it's always a better way that comes out. It never, in my experience, has happened to anyone that they thought that, and their unconscious brain, which implements all this stuff, says, okay, I'll give you a different way. How about a serious limp on one side? It doesn't work that way, because your unconscious brain, even just because it's unconscious, doesn't mean it's not doing a lot of thinking. And it gets that this person wants to perambulate across the room, but wants a different and presumably better way of doing it. And so that's sort of the origin of it.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, so for me, I think in terms of the I'm not doing everything or I'm not doing anything choice, my guess is that that's pretty much changes from person to person. A person might have much better results with one than the other, and it might change over time for the person. But that in general, when I've experimented with shifting around between the two, I don't sense a big difference. That's my experience, but someone else might. But the fact that they do kind of seem to overlap a lot, the anything and everything, is, I think, suggests that really, really reinforces the idea of what I guess people in the Alexander world like to call psychophysical integration, because the idea that everything affects everything else. You can't just separate out one thing and just change that without some accommodation to that everywhere in the system. And if you think I'm not doing a specific thing like walking, well, a lot of stuff has to change that's beyond just that. Or if you think I'm not doing anything or everything, since they produce similar results, suggests that the two are very closely related, and maybe in a very broad sense, it doesn't matter which one you use over time, that they're going to take you to more or less the same place. And that could only be true if there is that incredible psychophysical unity that Alexander talks about. And precisely because, like, if I think, okay, as I said, I'm not tightening my neck, everything has to fit in with that, or it's not going to be a very useful direction. But the complexity of all that internal stuff is way, way, way beyond anything your conscious brain can deal with.
Yeah.
It's got to be outsourced, and it's basically outsourced to the rest of your brain and the rest of your body, which does all that stuff at an unconscious level, but in many ways does a lot more than the conscious brain does. The conscious brain,
yes.
You know what? I want this, right? Fine. That's not that, it's got to be delivered to yourself in a useful way. You don't want to be barking commands at yourself and so on. But you just indicate what you want very softly, and then the rest of your body says, oh, okay, you can do that. And if
Yeah.
you say something nonsensical like I'm purple, which is a nice thing to play with, or green or yellow, whatever, it just says, oh, he's just playing games. You know, we're not gonna even listen to that.
Well,
That's
that's
my take on
interesting,
it.
actually. I found myself have to think of something much more boring because I do get a response to um, I'm purple or I'm green because I think it's amusing, and that in
Oh,
itself
that's
is
the okay.
usually
So
helpful to my youth. Um, so I
yeah,
usually have to
okay.
like, okay, the pavement is grey. You know, that's kind of boring, neutral.
Okay, so
Yeah,
yeah, make it a little more detached from you.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. But that's just something I noticed recently. Um, just coming back to, um, I think it's quite personal how we respond to these different directions,
absolutely.
and our subconscious systems will respond in different ways based on your own personal experiences and history in relationship to the words in some way, right? Um, but I
Absolutely. Yeah.
but I'm noticing I'm also um probably at this point quite a skilled observer of myself in noticing nuances of youth at this
Right.
point in my Alexander Technique journey, let's put it like that. But what I noticed with playing with these two thoughts, when I was doing some um, kind of mindful movements and balance exercises the other day, is that the one time that I'm not doing anything seemed detrimental to me doing these is with the balance ones, because I don't know, at that moment my body obviously felt it needed to do something to stay. It got very unstable, so it wasn't like I was trying to manage, but I noticed that I was more unstable at that moment. So it was just interesting to play with
Right.
these
And you know
directions
that
at
you
different
might
times.
even find that changes over time.
It might, but at that moment the I'm not doing everything was more helpful for the balanced ones
I mean, I think most
when I kind of went
people,
back and forth.
if
Yeah.
you say, if someone says, well, what's going on? And I say, and someone asks you, well, what's going on right now with you? You say, well, I'm not doing anything.
Hmm.
Most people would interpret that as, well, you know, she's just not doing anything.
Yeah.
But that's not what the direction is
Yeah.
about.
I
It's
think
about,
that's what my initial response wasn't so favorable to
yeah,
it. And the more I played with it and kind of I got to really understand, I don't know, I think I got what you were after with the direction.
right. And we were talking before the podcast, and you have a quote from one of your students that
Well, I
right.
just at the end of one of my student sessions last week, I just mentioned this bizarre direction, and she has some experience with other directions, so it wasn't out of the blue. Um, I heard from her a couple of days later that she'd been finding it really powerful. Um, and she said it creates a kind of a feeling of stopping within her, and I think that's in an what you might call an Alexandrian way, a kind of a letting, and that she could move without thinking of what's happening next. It kind of it sounds a bit like the kind of the idea of the when we stop doing the wrong thing, the right thing happens, which I think
Yeah.
is 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 kind of what this paradoxical and inhibitory direction is about, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Actually, if you
um,
could read that quote of hers, because I think it's just a
yeah,
really good quote.
yeah. She said it creates the feeling of stopping within me, and I just move without thinking of what's happening next. This morning, my art teacher and I were both amazed at how I did this painting naturally during my lesson without her guidance or my heretofore typical self-doubt.
Wow. So
So
Yeah,
that's
that's
taking it into a
exactly what
totally
we would.
different, yeah,
Yes, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah. One other thing that I think I mentioned this to you last time we talked, but it also played with adding um, I don't have to the beginning of these things.
Oh,
I don't have to do anything and I don't have to do everything. I find sometimes that I don't have to idea is very freeing in the same way I am free is freeing, right? It makes it longer, but that's something I also played with and I came back to just the pure kind of I'm not doing anything. But a couple of my students really preferred that I don't have to being part of it. So it's just
right.
notice notice how you respond and what works for you.
Right. I mean, I think with any Alexander direction, it's going to have different results for different people, and some people might really benefit more from one. I think that you got to be flexible, and I think maybe not to criticize the great man himself, but Mr. Alexander. But I think when it came to directions, I think it was very clever of him to come up with the idea of directions. But I don't think the directions he came up with were really, I think they were not optimal, I would say. And, there's this phrase, people would say, well, I can't, he would have rather lengthy directions, neck to be free, head to move this way, blah, 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 back lengthen, a whole sequence of things. And people would say, well, I just can't do that. It's just too much. And it's too much for your prefrontal cortex doesn't have that many memory slots to start with, and most of them are taken up with crucial things that you better not drop. So but his answer was, well, how about, what was it, one after the other all at the same time? I find that deeply unsatisfying personally.
I understand what you're saying, and I can understand that when you're very familiar with those classic directions, that you may that they do kind of merge together, and you may be able to use some sort of shorthand for yourself. So it
Maybe,
all,
yeah.
I do think they're fraught with dangers of trying to do them and make something happen. And of course the instruction is it's just a thought, but I think there are other directions where it's easier to not interfere like that. Let's put
Well,
it like that.
even we don't know historically exactly when he started using directions, but by the early 30s, for sure, we have an interview. Well, we have a really nice piece written by George Trevelyan on his first training course, who made a point of asking Alexander questions and then writing down the answers. And Alexander said to him once, I don't have the exact words, but it was, most of my students don't believe that all they have to do is think the thought and that will do the trick. That's pretty much his words. And he adds, they're all slaves to their muscles. I mean, so I think he was frustrated with how people responded to his directions or didn't. And that probably or possibly, and this is a whole historical thing, and who knows, but that could have been when he eventually said to his class one day, well, I can do it for them now. I'll just zap them. And if I zap them enough, they'll
Your
get
words at this point. I don't
my
think he
words.
said
He did not say zap them, but that he would just use his hands in a way that got them out of their old use patterns to a certain extent, and they'd get better. And if you kept doing that, someone could improve without doing any thinking at all. Or maybe the idea was you do the zapping for a while, and then if they get to a point when they can start thinking in a useful way. I will say also that Walter Carrington, with whom I had quite a few lessons when I was in London training on a Walter Carrington type course, in fact, the first non-first generation teacher course. I asked him once what he would say to students when he was working with them, because Walter wouldn't talk about. And my experience was he didn't talk about the Alexander technique at all directly. He kind of went into a little spiel that kind of got you into a good place. And he said, for the first 10 lessons with a new student, I'll do anything I can to avoid any discussion of the Alexander technique, which is pretty much the opposite of how I teach. But I could see what he was getting at. I just got to get them to a place where they can usefully start to think in a useful way. And
there are different ways.
The way he found worked for him was I use my hands, I tell them little stories, little metaphors and stuff, and it goes into their brain and they get better. And it works. I mean, that will work as a teaching method. It's not one that I like personally, but it sure does work. So anyway.
There are many different ways.
Many different paths to improvement. Well, anything else you want to add to this discussion?
I don't think so, except that I'd again be interested if people try out this little thought for themselves. I don't have to do anything, or I don't have to do everything, and just notice what happens to you when you think that as you are walking along or sitting at your desk or doing whatever.
Watching The Crown on TV.
Indeed.
Right. Okay. Well, I think this would be a good place to end. My guest today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. I'll put a link to her site. I'll put a link to maybe a page that talks about directions a bit, or has a lot of information about self-directing, and a page that you can learn more about the Alexander technique in general. So Imogen, thank you so much for doing this.
You're very welcome. Thank you.